The lesson.
Oh yeah.
Where did it go to the next level?
I think for me, there was a couple moments. I was making mixtapes and selling them locally in Phoenix at the time out of a store called Swell. And Swell was kind of like the clothing store, hip-hop shop, graffiti shop, record store, rave kind of outlet. It was like the one spot, you know what I mean? Like, if anything was happening in the underground scene, and people in that store knew about it or could find out about it. So selling my tapes to through there, I remember I'd bring down 10 tapes and, $10 a tape to the guy. And yeah, cool, I get $100, I'm stoked. And I'd come back, a couple weeks later, he'd be like, yo, man, we sold out all of your tapes. I was like, oh, yeah, I'll get you 10 more. He's like, no, but we sold out of all of them in 2 days. I was like, what? He's like, you need to bring back like 30 tapes. I was like, cool, do it. So I'd go to like Kinko's and, hand cut all the covers and had to go to the tape duplicating guy. And was like, hey, man, I need another, 50 tapes or whatever it was. And it was just the hustle of that whole thing of getting them out there. But the thing is, once that started to happen, the tapes started to spread around and people would call me from like San Francisco and be like, hey, man, I heard your tape from a friend of mine who had a thing. Can we get some tapes? I was like, yeah, cool. So it really just became about becoming my own distribution of like, and having a notepad with like, sold 10 tapes to San Francisco, got a phone call from this guy who wants 5 tapes, or this guy still has 10 of my tapes and hasn't paid me. I got to track that. So it became this whole thing of a hustle of the music was starting to get out there and the tapes were starting to get out there. And then the gig started. Because then it was like, hey, so-and-so from San Francisco heard your tape and wants to have you come out and play a party. Oh, what do I even charge for that? I don't, it's like it's all uncharted territory. So that happened, rapidly, but then it also turned into the tapes that made their way overseas. And I was starting to, make volume 3, volume whatever, and just start really doing the tape thing pretty hardcore. And I would get these calls from people like in Germany and go like, hey, we have this B-boy event called Battle of the Year. We want you to come out and DJ for it. We heard your B-boy mixtape and we loved it. I was like, cool, let's do it. So here I am negotiating prices to go overseas. Don't know the first thing about it. Don't have a passport. Don't know any, you know what I mean? Like I'm just winging it. But the demand based off of that, and every time I would go and play, I was very aware of like, I've got to show and prove. I got to kill it. I'd get there early. I'd set up. Everything was about like making sure I got called back. You know what I mean? Making sure I made an impression, making sure people dug it. And it was really about just trying to take over. So that was sort of the big pivotal turn of like, saying to the guy at the pizza place, like, hey, man, I got to stop making pizzas because I got to go to Europe and go DJ a thing. And they're like, what? Yeah, it's like, yeah, man, this whole thing is just starting to happen. And, when that happened, it just changed everything. And before I knew it, I was, I wasn't making a lot of money, but I was making enough money to continue doing the hustle, and it's like, instead of getting the budget tape that was like, your white tape with the black writing on it, it's like for 20 more cents a tape, you can get the clear one that's like green. I'm like, oh, let me do that. It's way more fly. You know what I mean? It's just investing back into the deal. Yeah, and then I ended up, I think another big one was, this is around 93, 94, 95, so I don't know, early 90s. I got approached by David Paul from Bomb Records, and he was putting together a series called Return of the DJ. And it was basically a record, all of DJ sort of cuts. Back in the day, everyone would have like their songs, and they would give the DJ a track, to do his thing. EPMD did the DJ Caleb Boss. He would have his track. Steady B would do like a Tap Money thing. Jazzy Jeff the Fresh Prince. Jazzy Jeff would have his track, whatever it was. So David Paul reached out and was like, hey, man, we're doing an all DJ album, and we'd love for you to be on it. It's called Return of the DJ. So I did a track for that, and that ended up making a whole bunch of noise. And then it's like, we're doing volume 2. I was like, did that. So here I was all of a sudden making records. I was like, I'm on a record. Like that moment when you get your first record that you've made as a DJ that's kind of, I think, the cassettes, and that was the moment where I was like, there's really no turning back, because the rush I'm getting off of this is so intense, coupled with the fact that because I had DJ'd all these different events and things, I knew how to do a party for, old white people who wanted to get married. I knew how to do a young hip hop party for kids who wanted to just wild out on some raw hip hop stuff. I knew how to do a b-boy thing. I knew how to play rock records. I knew how to and all of a sudden this rave stuff was coming. I'm like, let me mess around with that and see how I can interject hip hop into that. And it really, because I kept my mind open to everything and I incorporated everything, I think that's why my style stood out for most people, because I really wasn't trying to just stick to what was safe. I was just doing what I like to do, and I started building an audience.
At which point did you find yourself starting to headline your own shows and your own tours?
That was, I think, it's kind of funny because I started to headline in certain circuits, like the b-boy events. I would start to be like top billing in a b-boy event. Like, oh, you guys eat your plan? Oh, it's going to be dope, because of the tapes, people knew. But in the hip hop world, like in doing, like playing those shows, I was basically, I threw a few parties of my own, you know what I mean? Where it was like, I want to see these people play. So I would just get on the phone and call people and be like, hey man, I'm this guy out here in Arizona right now, and how much would it take for you to get out here? And it's like, if I got somebody, like I brought Saphir out, I brought q-bert out, Mixmaster Mike, Automator, some of these guys who, I didn't know these guys, but I just brought them out. So it ended up becoming that, because I was so associated with the hip hop scene locally, that if I just was doing a party and my name was on it, people would be there. So I kind of ended up sort of headlining in that regard. But then there was these other local promoters who were bringing out hip hop acts that were playing at like this place called the Roxy and a couple other spots. But they'd bring out like Souls of Mischief and Farside or Goody Mob or the Roots or whoever, and I was always the guy that they would have open because I had a following, A, and B, they knew that I would deliver. And it was sort of that time when like all these bands were starting to sort of get like early 90s, like bands were just getting people were finding out about them, and it's like, oh, I got to go see this. Have you heard of Hieroglyphics? What? Who's that? Oh yeah, it's amazing. And Dell and Casual, what? I don't know. Just come to the show, and people would see them, and it would change them. You know what I mean? Because that just the music that was happening at that point was so intense. But even though I was opening, but to open for Biggie Smalls, to open for Naughty by Nature, to open for the Fugees, you know what I mean? Open for Wu-Tang. It was basically me, then Wu-Tang, you know what I mean? And that, at the time, it allowed me to, that was a headlining gig in the DJ world. Like, if you were the DJ and that was, you couldn't get any bigger than that for me. But then I started noticing that people would see and hear about me even more, and then they started flying me out to places and asking me to come out and just do my thing. And then the crazy thing was, like, when I would see some of these people that I was opening for or had opened for, 2 years later, it's like, oh, I'm doing a show, and who was it? Master Ace is opening for me. It's like, whoa, what the fuck? It's Master Ace. And it was really hard for me because I still hold Master Ace up high. You know what I mean? Like, or any of these people, I'd be, wait a second, J-Ru's opening for me? Like, I'm the guy who went out and ran out and bought 2 copies of Come Clean and beat the shit out of that record. You know what I mean? Ain't the Devil Happy? I know all the lyrics. You know what I mean? So it was a very weird time because I started to realize, like, people were coming out to see me, and there was in such a capacity that it was starting to get bigger and bigger. And really, raves, hip hop shows, b-boy events, it just became kind of like they just kind of bled into one another. All I knew is that every week or every couple days, I'm swapping my crate out for like in a completely different style of music. It's like, oh, hey, you're going to be playing this late night thing, and it's going to be all like, down tempo, mellow shit. It's like, oh, cool. All right, well, I break out all my like jazz funk things. Oh, hey, tomorrow you're going to play this thing, and you're opening for Slayer. Oh, okay, cool. I'm doing all metal stuff, then I'm doing an all metal set. But that was the thing. It wasn't like I just had one lane. It's like all the lanes started to pop, and I think one of the biggest things was because I was throwing rock records into the mix, like really bizarre Pink Floyd records or Led Zeppelin records that weren't normally, you wouldn't normally hear it in a hip hop club, but because I was sandwiching it between certain things or figuring out a way to interject it into the mix, I started getting people coming up to me and saying like, dude, that set you played was amazing. And I'd be like, oh, that's awesome. They're like, yeah, I played for 4 hours straight. And they'd be like, that one mix you did with Van Halen was amazing. And you're like, I played 4 hours of music. And you came up and said something about the Van Halen, the one thing. And I was like, and so it made me stop and go, wait a second, there's maybe a little something to the fact of going outside of the conventional box and mixing these records that are like, you just wouldn't hear in a club, you know what I mean, at the time. And that's the thing that the next big turning point was the fact that I'd been doing that throughout the, all the time, even on these b-boy tapes or whatever. I'd always throw a weird curveball sort of element in there just to keep people on their toes, just so it wasn't predictable. But these shows, I started getting that this sort of feedback from people that they really liked when I would do the rock shit or whatever. So I ended up doing a show in Springfield, Missouri, and ran into DJ P, and there was another guy who was doing sort of the same weird stuff, like taking 80s records and mixing them with whatever, and it was like, this guy's unconventional, and we started talking. We both realized that we kind of had the same approach, and so we did a mix. I invited him out to my house. He came and stayed for a week, and we ended up doing Uneasy Listening, and that became huge for us because we were like, let's do a mix where all we're doing is that weird stuff, not the really typical, whatever the latest new Most Def song was at the time or whatever. It's like, let's do really bizarre, intricate mixes with, Midnight Oil and Metallica and Madonna and the Beastie Boys and Rush and Metallica, whatever it was. And we did it kind of a little bit as a goof, kind of like, this is just showcases us just being bizarre. And the response on that, it ended up getting reviewed in Rolling Stone and then Spin and then a couple other people. And before we knew it, it was kind of right around the time that Napster was going on, and it started to spread in Napster, and then it just got out of hand. And before I knew it, it was like, we thought people were going to shit on it. We kind of like, they're going to hate this. We're going to get so many, because it was like a moment of like, when hip hop was very much about keep it real, man, represent the real. And you were like, yeah, because there was a lot of, R&B and stuff that just wasn't hardcore, and people want hardcore stuff. And I represented that, but I also represented a complete opposite of that as well in the same breath, But yeah, that thing blew up. We ended up both doing a whole bunch of different shows. He went and opened for 311. I ended up opening for Linkin Park. All of a sudden, we're like thrust into the mainstream, and people wanted to see and hear this stuff, and it really kicked off the whole mashup movement in a major way. And so that's really it. Once that happened, then I got approached to make a record. All the record labels started knocking on the door. Moved out to LA, signed with Hollywood Records, put out my first album. And that album was a very, I wanted to make another mix record, but nobody really knew how to clear samples like that. Like if you're AC/DC and you're Led Zeppelin and I use both of your songs to create something and play it for you, and they're like, yeah, you can use our stuff, but we want 100% of the publishing. Well, if I'm using 100%, if there's only 100% of one thing and they want 100 and you want 100, we couldn't. So it's like, it had to be 50-50, and people nobody really understood how to make that deal, because it was such a bizarre concept of mixing these things and percentages and whatever. So I ended up not being able to make an official record like that. So I ended up just making a hip hop record. I'm like, well, let me make a record that's like my roots. So I had a Whip or Whip on it, Grandmaster Caz, some of the original MCs from the Bronx and from New York, and but then also had new cats as well, Bus Driver and Soup from Jurassic 5, Lyrics Born, Supernatural, and made that record, and that did really well. And yeah, man, it just kept it's funny, man. I never set out to do this officially, but just because it's always been about the music for me. It's always been about trying to connect music to other people and grab different things and just play with music, that I found a core audience of people who are into my style of mixing and are into what I do. And so that's it, man. It's like once that happened, I realized this, you know, that was the last biggest turning point for me to go, all right, I think I can do this for a living. I think if I do this, if I keep my head together and really just focus, I could do this. And I never looked back, man. It's just been nonstop.
The lesson.
Q-7. Oh yeah.